All right. Well, thanks for gathering with us again for another episode where we talk about racism together. I've got Michael McCullough and Chiffon Wong with me to talk a little bit about that with you. Again, I want to remind you that one of the things that we are doing is we're doing this video for our congregation and sharing some things together about racism. And today is about communicating experience and having to deal with racism. So Michael, I'm going to turn to you at this point, and I just have some questions that members have asked, and I'm going to go ahead and ask those questions to you, and you and Chiffon can help me walk through them together, okay? Thanks. So first question, when did you first have to deal with prejudice?
That's a good question. I dealt with prejudice kind of all my life growing up in the South. And so I can answer that question, by giving examples when I was 5, where I was 10, where I was 12, but that was almost 50 years ago. So instead, why don't I give you an example, a recent example that I dealt with racism here in Massachusetts.
Okay.
About 6 months ago. So about 6 months ago, coming into work, I work in Kendall Square in Cambridge, and coming in, I was coming in crossing the street, and there was a white gentleman in a bicycle with a black gentleman, and I were crossing the street. The white gentleman saw us, and he kind of, it was a little bit of an abruptive drive, and he almost ran us over. And the black gentleman said, "Hey, be careful." And the guy shouted out the N-word. And it was interesting because, and I had a real visceral response because I'm thinking, here I'm in Kendall Square. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. This guy's on a bike, and he literally, and we just say, "Hey, just be careful." And he just decided to just shout out the N-word. And then I had a response, I said, "Whoa, really?" And then he just said, all you N-words should die. And just kept going on. And this was, and it was a pretty, it shook me up for a while. My first intent was that, man, where's a rock? Because I'm gonna throw a rock and knock this guy off his bike. And then I thought about the risk, and I was shaking up for about 30 minutes. And so, and I guess the reason why I share this is because even now, in 2020, in a diverse cultural mix city like Cambridge, where coming into work, that immediately went to that response.
Mm. Wow. And for something like that just to happen when you're on the street like that, that's what's the impact of these kinds of things in your life?
Yeah. Well, for me, it really created a sense of sadness. The first sense was angry, as I said. Immediate response, grew up in the South, we dealt with racist comments in a very aggressive way. I've evolved, I've considered myself a Christian, I'm still on the path, but that still comes out every now and then. You take the boy out of Houston, but you can't take the Houston out of the boy, so to speak. But the thought was, though, is that, but then the really sense of sadness really was disappointing. And I actually talked to a friend of mine who a white guy. I went to his office and I explained what happened. And I was almost like shaking because I was so angry and so sad at the same time, thinking about myself, thinking about others, and then thinking about, man, it's still having to deal with that even in 2020, and really thinking about my children as well that will have to probably deal with something like that. So the feeling of sadness came over, and then I talked through it and then start having conversations, and I was able to feel better about it later. But the fact that it happened really created a strong sense of sadness.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned your children, Michael, and I find that is the hardest part of anti-Black racism for me. Our son Princeton, when he was 6, he came home from school one day and pretty much told us that, he was in the cafeteria, when a child said, "I don't like Black people," and that was really hard, him coming home and sharing this with me and me needing to really, first I was upset that he had to tell me and that no one in the school had communicated to me. So I had to have some conversations regarding that. Thankfully, I had already made him aware about anti-Black racism and what that may look like and that he might experience it. So he wasn't shocked, I think, because he had kind of been prepared by us regarding, this part of kind of living in this country. But it is, I think the hardest part is this idea that there's going to be a point in time in which there are going to be people in society who, instead of seeing our son for just the dynamic, beautiful person he is and all the facets, are going to start to associate a lot of the stereotypical and prejudicial ideas with him, other than seeing him for who he is. And so having to have those conversations with him about why things are this way and the history and what that may look like and what that means for him. I mean, my husband and I have had conversations regarding like what he can wear. Like we've had conversations like, can you wear that hoodie or not, and why, and what that means. And, most people probably don't think about like the significance of like your child wearing a hoodie or not. But all of these things have very different connotations when you are, of African descent in this country, especially when you're in communities where you might be one of the few people in that community, or if you're in a community that's being kind of hyper policed. So those are the hardest parts, more as a parent than even for myself.
So you brought up school there. Both of you have children. Would you speak to some of your experience? Has school and the education system been overall a healthy place, or what's your experience there?
So my son goes to the International School of Boston. So the good news is that it's a very diverse environment. We have a lot of people from Haiti, from some of the African-speaking countries, and from France. So it's mainly a French school. And so I've actually talked to the head principal about about diversity, about how he's trying to be inclusive, about how he's reaching out to the communities. And so we've had the chat, and they've had conversations. There's a lot of issues in France with the French and some anti-Semitic activities. So that's been also kind of a theme. So they've been dealing with some of those things quite a bit, and the principal has been quite open. We've had some pretty honest and frank conversations about it. Yep.
In the town of Burlington, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on, not only just as being a parent and also being a town meeting member, but I became aware of a lot of the challenges that our own town was facing in the space. And so I really was the lead proponent for obtaining funds from the town so that our schools could have a dedicated professional to focus on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Burlington. So for example, the current staff in Burlington now is approximately 96% white, despite the fact that the children who are taught self-identify, 36% as non-white, right? And there have regretfully been a lot of incidences even this year of, race-based injuries that children have experienced. And as we were leading this effort to really advocate for this position, a lot of people disclosed things to me verbally and written about their lived experience in town. There had been people who had not taken certain classes, advanced scientific classes, because there had been, staff who were racist and who were creating very hostile environments. And so compared to other towns, Burlington is a lot earlier on the curve in terms of, staffing more diversely, in terms of having, for example, incident response plans. So when an incident happens, like the one my son experienced when he was 6, there really was no protocol for that. There was no tracking for that. So we need a lot more infrastructure and a lot more support to help educators and also administrators improve their cultural competence. Regretfully, when I was going to school, I did encounter many teachers who were prejudiced and racist. I grew up in New York City, and again, there was a lot of disparities between the representation of the actual staff and the students. And I was always a very strong student, but I had many teachers who told me, "Well, you don't need to apply there. Like, why would you apply there?"
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of steering and tracking, which we see. We even know in many instances there's difference in disciplinary approaches that are taken. The perception of how do you manage through things in the classroom, and that being managed very differently based upon, again, these kind of stereotypes and prejudices. And so it does require a certain type of hypervigilance from a parenting perspective to make sure that your child is not finding themselves tracked disproportionately, or being more harshly disciplined, or not be given as much equity in terms of challenging experiences because of the perception that your child in some way is academically inferior and doesn't deserve the same access to more rigorous options.
To just one point, Siobhan raises a point. When I was in college, I played baseball, which is typically a white sport back in the 90s. Yeah, it was really much a white sport back then. And I was the only person of color playing in the whole Central Texas. And so I would go to places like Lubbock, where I would have to be, I would have to really get in and get out of there quickly because of the racism. I would be in towns, in some point, I was in Austin, I would get watermelon rinds thrown at me. I would get chicken bones thrown at me. The amount of racist names I've been called from playing baseball. I mean, the fans were just really, the players were sometimes, but the fans were just so brutal. And I wasn't Jackie Robinson, of course, but it really put it in perspective that I had to learn how to respond in a certain way to kind of keep my cool. And I remember had coach telling me, look, there was so much expectation of me as an African-American. From my coach said, look, I never coached a black player before. I expect you to be such an amazing athlete that this shouldn't be the case. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's life in Zoom land. Okay, going back, so you shared some things about how it affects you, and but how does a person handle these kinds of personal attacks? I mean, to kind of go through what you described with baseball and that experience, how does a person handle it?
Person of color, it's hard because that's really an individual perception. Look,
sure.
One would hope to say, "Blessed be the peacemakers." That's what the ideal is. That and Jesus talks about turning on the cheek. Look, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet, and that's a journey that I don't know if I'm ever going to be there. However, having said that, I do recognize that some people are uneducated or have these fixed mindset and have a certain way about themselves because they haven't been exposed. They don't want to learn. They grew up a certain way. And so part of it that I try to take approach is that a little bit of, look, clearly this person has challenges, has an issue. And so, and my point is first to say, look, I'm going to kind of dismiss this person being, as they are, particularly as it relates to me. Now, when it relates to the kids, it becomes harder because then the parenting comes out. But my thinking is that, look, this person clearly has a problem. And instead of trying to accelerate or escalate the problem, try to de-escalate it a bit while still holding firm in what I believe in, not being run over. Chase, that's a hard one, Chase. It really is, because each person has to handle it differently. When I was younger, I handled it much differently than how I handled it. Stop laughing, Siobhan. This is how I handle it now versus how I handle it now. But it is something that I continue, because depending on the day, depending on the mood, I have to, and reminding myself that, and believe it or not, reminding myself that I'm a Christian above everything else, that always kind of grounds me. And to be honest, it's probably keeping me out of trouble for a long time had I not continue to remind myself that I'm a Christian. I'm just being honest. Yep. Siobhan, I'm sure you can appreciate what I'm saying. No?
Oh, 100%. So that question is so interesting because I think there are a range of responses depending on the situation, and also depending upon the magnitude of the offense. There are people who can be offensive and you can tell it's just that they might not have a lot of experience being more interdependent and cooperative, or they're just not informed. People sometimes say things and you're just like, this person, and so there's a continuum of offense kind of. And when someone is kind of on this more, I don't want to say benign level of offense, it's a lot easier to either, sometimes you just ignore it because it can really drain you. If you start kind of dealing with all of it, you won't have the resources to do what you need to do for yourself. And so there's, I should respond to the question this way. We know there's racism. We expect racism. I hate to say it that way. Like, we expect to encounter it. So that helps us, like, as defensively, not be so shocked, not be so, it's like, well, what did you expect? You know,
Yes, exactly.
we expect white supremacy, we expect to see prejudice. And so there's a baseline level there that you have to really do something outside of the norm to kind of get a reaction from most of us, because our parents, our grandparents, you know, they taught us this, they trained, we've seen it all of our lives. So it's not that we are desensitized to it, because we're not, but we're not surprised.
That's good.
And so that is a bit of a coping strategy. And it also does mean that trust does not come the way someone might think it comes. It takes a while for me. Like, I have to know, like, do you kind of get it? Like, do you get it? Are you, you know, like, can I trust you?
Yes, agree.
And so there is something to be said for not an enmity, but a hesitancy and a reserve until someone can demonstrate themselves, like, what are their views and what did their family teach them? So there's kind of like this assessment observation period that kind of happens even when you're trying to relationship build, to see if it's kind of a safe space. Because the nature of, you know, this country, and if someone has not put the work in to be actively anti-racist, you know that there are things there that at some point in time will come out that you'll have to deal with. And this can make certain people kind of just not want to deal with it, like not want to be in spaces. If you're in a space where you are a minority most of the time, it's very tiring. It's very tiring to be a minority in majority spaces at work, at your job, in your church. And so there is definitely an affinity at times to just be amongst people who you know understand you, and you can feel safer. So it does relate to certain preferences for socialization, because it does take a certain type of cognitive load to kind of navigate a situation where you're being a little more vigilant because you don't really know. So the range of responses, as Michael said, it can be more benign, such as, like, you know, this person doesn't know. And if you think they're decent intention, you might take them aside and say, you know, I want you to understand. You might try to educate someone, or you might just overlook it. There's other times where, you know, everyone has a right to self-defense. Everyone has a right to self-defense. And so, you know, people have to keep that in mind. Everyone has a right to defend themselves and their families. And I think people have to understand, in this country, there has been a history of domestic terrorism against us. State sanctioned. We have had communities that have been destroyed and bombed and crosses burned and people lynched and dragged. This is the history of what we've encountered here. And so people cannot be expected to continually accept persecution and, you know, not defend themselves. That's not natural. And so I think there has to be an understanding for the patience and forbearance that have been demonstrated, which is quite in contrast to the violent hostility that we have often faced in communities across the country, and even at the hands of our own government, which has protected us and not protected us under the law to some extent. So I think people have to really understand that if you've been traumatized as a people for hundreds of years, that does influence the lens in which you look at the world.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. Let's turn to another question now. One of the questions that came to me, and let me read it here. So one of the questions we had was, due to mistreatment or prejudice, did it cause you to have any negative attitude towards others?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'd love you to add it. Look, when I was younger, it really did. I stereotype. Humans have that nature to protection, is that because you experience something, when you touch the stove, you know it gets hot and you burn yourself, then you kind of feel that defense mechanism. And so when you experience racism so much, it created for a long time that I thought most white people were racist. To Chifon's point earlier, Chifon made a point earlier, is that the ability to trust white people took a long time. Only now have I gotten comfortable saying that, that all white people is racist. And I hate that I say that, but because I grew up, most of the white people I encountered were racist, or they would say things, they either say racist jokes or make racist statements or use racial epithets. And so I was conditioned for a long time that most white people were racist. My parents probably thought that. I'm a part of an interracial marriage. My parents were not super excited because they had this perception of how white people treated people. And so it does create that. I think, and it's my spiritual growth and my experiences, growing older and living in other parts of the world, I've learned that that's not the case. But it took a long time for me to get comfortable, to be able to trust. And even now, that trust is not blind. It's still a concern. But so, yep.
Thanks, Michael. Well, thank you for sharing today and for walking through these things with us. Was there anything you'd like to add before we conclude our time together today?
Well, why don't you go first, and if you don't, I'll give the floor to you first, and I'll.
No, I'm glad that we had this opportunity to kind of reflect on some of the experiences that we've had. We've also know that others in our family have had that have, kind of shaped our ability to really connect. And I think the framing is so interesting because prejudice and racism do disrupt connection. It keeps us from being able to appreciate the fullness of who we are as people and all the beauty we can bring to each other's lives. And so it's true. Racism is so disruptive of connection.
Yeah, look, I think it's always good to be able to have an open conversation. One of the things I always say in our diversity and inclusion meetings is that we have to be comfortable having the uncomfortable conversation. Because if you're not able to have that conversation, then you can't understand the other person's point of view. You're not learning, you're not growing. And we all have different experiences. And so I'm not going to judge anyone because of different experiences. Well, I'm going to judge them to how they respond. You might grow up a certain style, a certain way, but the fact that once you become enlightened, and particularly nowadays when there's so much information out there, is that what is it? Silence is complicit. Complicit is silence. I do believe that, because now, and everyone, something very small. You see someone make a racist joke, don't accept it. You know what I mean? If you see someone is struggling, in a certain scenario, be Christ-like. You know what I mean? And these are the things I think they're going to be critical. And then although for my generation, it's really our kids. It's not what you do when you're in a big room in front of everyone else. It's what you do when you talk to your children about how to handle situations, or they hear something on the radio, or they see something on TV, a movie. That's where I think the real impact is. And so it's really about trying to make sure we create an environment where our children believe racism is not acceptable. Yep. Whether not just in public, and so don't say that in front of them, but we say it at home. You have to make sure you kind of really walk the walk and talk the talk. Yep.
Well,
thanks, Chase, for doing this.
I think that there's some lead in there for our next video, which is about kind of where do we go from here and how do we do it together. And so one of those things probably is going to be that conversation of having conversations that are uncomfortable. So I look forward to getting to do that next one with you as well.
Good.
Thanks, Chifon. Thank you, Michael.